Welcome to the EPG Pathshala Linguistics course. I'm Prabal Dasgupta. I work at the Indian Statistical Institute in Kolkata, and I'm responsible for the morphology and syntax paper of the course, in which this is module number 25. It deals with some cyclic and root processes in Indian languages. You can tell from the title what the objective is of this module. We wish to display to you some of the phenomena of the syntax of Indian languages so that you become accustomed to the phenomena and the slight variation among languages in these domains. We begin with some cyclic processes and then we move to some root processes. The cyclic process we begin with was illustrated briefly towards the end of the preceding module in the e-text, though we did not highlight that in the oral exposition. In that context, we had spoken about the process of raising to subject in English, which sometimes applies in successive cycles from the bottom of the tree to the top of the tree, thus taking the subject from the lowest subject through the intermediate subject positions to the highest subject in the matrix sentence. That was called successive cyclic raising. In English, there is also successive cyclic WH movement, which occurs in two varieties of sentences. It affects question WH words like who, which, where, etc. with a question mark attached, and it affects relative WH words, as in the man who you met yesterday is Sally's brother. Thus, you can take a question word from the bottom of a sentence with multiple embedding to the top. The traffic will take you through successive cycles. Consider sentence 1 in English. Whom did John think Mary said you believed the mafia had killed? This whom begins as the object of killed in the lowest S. It then undergoes WH movement and hits the left edge of that lowest sentence node. Then you get whom the mafia had killed. From that position, it moves to the left edge of the you believed sentence, the second lowest sentence in the tree. At that stage, you have whom you believed the mafia had killed. In the third part of its journey, the word whom moves from whom you believed to whom Mary said. At that stage, you've got whom Mary said you believed the mafia had killed. In the fourth and final leg of its journey, it moves to the root sentence, so that you get the output, whom did John think Mary said you believed the mafia had killed? This is how the whom moves through the cycles. It's called successive cyclic. In addition to the interrogative example 1, we also see successive cyclic movement of a WH element. In the relative clause example 2, David is the man whom John thought Mary said you believed the mafia had killed. And in the comparative construction example 3, recall that in comparative constructions there is a WH element which gets obligatorily deleted. The example we've chosen is the mafia has killed far more people than John thought Mary said you believed it had killed. How do we know that the WH element moves through successive cycles? What is there to say to show that it does not go from its original deep structure position, the object position of the lowest S, directly to the top of the tree? How do we know that it hops and hops and hops? The evidence for the claim that WH movement is successive cyclic comes from many sources. For your purposes, we will give one kind of evidence. We will show you that these legs of the journey we are talking about are made possible by intermediate sponsors which make the journey smooth and thereby make it possible. These intermediate sponsors in the sentence are in each case the verbs of the sentences in which the lower sentence is embedded. So a verb like think or say or believe in English is willing to sponsor this successive cyclic movement of the WH. These are called bridge verbs. The metaphor people use is that you can walk over a bridge. So the WH walks over the bridge verb and goes to the next cycle above. To show that these are verbs with the special property of bridgehood, we can give you examples where other verbs that are non-bridge verbs occur in the middle of the sentence and they block successive cyclic WH movement. When you try to cross those non-bridges, the result is a bad sentence. Non-bridge verbs in English are verbs which express communication but at the same time emphasize the manner of speaking. Verbs like murmur, whisper, shout, scream have the property of being non-bridge verbs. Thus, if you take one of these sentences and put in a few manner of speaking verbs, the result is quite bad. If you take whom did John murmur, Mary said, you shouted the mafia had killed, example 4. As you can see, it's a bad sentence in English. Likewise, if you do this with relatives, David is the man whom John whispered, Mary screamed, you believe the mafia had killed, that also is quite bad. How does this play out in Indian languages? Well, in Indian languages, there are different strategies used in different languages. Some of them have deep-rooted strategies that all speakers are quite happy with. Other languages, such as Hindi, Urdu, show a minority of speakers accepting a strategy and many other speakers saying that they're unhappy with these sentences. There must be other situations in other languages that I cannot speak for. In Bangla, there is a special complementizer that occurs to the right of its clause. It is called a quotative complementizer. The shape is bole. When you have a quotative complementizer, what it does is, although the WH constituent does not physically move from the lowest S through successive cycles to the highest S, the semantic effect and thus the syntactic effect of the WH constituent does go through these cycles and does reach the top. For example, the Bangla sentence 5, which is mafia kake mereche bole tumi bishwash koro bole Mary janiyeche bole John bhebechilo, which is a translation of sentence 1 in English. Whom did John think Mary said you believe the mafia had killed? What you get in Bangla is that the WH phrase whom, the Bangla form is kake, remains in the lowest embedded sentence. It doesn't shift. However, the effect of asking that question keeps traveling from cycle to cycle and reaches the top, so that the entire sentence is a direct question with a question mark. The interrogative effect is felt at the root sentence level, which is equivalent to syntactic movement of the WH phrase from the lowest to the highest cycle. We are trying to illustrate the diversity across languages, which is why we now shift to Hindi, Urdu, where there is nothing like the Bangla quotative complementizer bole. Hindi, Urdu does not have a language-wise strategy for this that all speakers accept. It has a strategy that apparently only a minority of speakers accept, called the expletive strategy. The interrogative expletive element kya can be planted in the successive cycles, and for some speakers that has the same effect as the Bangla series of boles. So you get, for those speakers, a Hindi Urdu sentence like, John ne kya socha, ki Mary ne kya kaha, ki tumne kya samjha, ki mafia ne kisko maar dala. Literally, this is, what did John think? That. What did Mary say? That. What did you believe? That. Whom did the mafia kill? That is the literal form of the sentence. What it means is, who did John think Mary said you believed the mafia had killed? I repeat that this only works for some speakers of Hindi, Urdu. It does not work for others. It is not like the Bangla bole strategy which is entrenched in the language and which is fine for all speakers. The effect is exactly like Bangla. The Hindi WH phrase, like the Bangla WH phrase, does not physically move to the top. Its effect successive cyclically travels through the cycles and reaches the root sentence, yielding the outcome that the entire sentence counts as a direct question. The evidence for this claim that there is successive cyclic notional WH movement for Bangla and for Hindi Urdu is exactly like the evidence for English. If you substitute manner of speaking verbs for these bridge verbs of the believe and say and think type, then the sentence crashes, indicating that it was the bridge verbs that were sponsoring the successive cyclic movement of the effect of the WH word in the first place. We'll give you one example to make the point. In example 8 from Bangla, instead of a bridge verb, we have substituted phukre utheche, which is blurted out in the second sentence down, and in the top clause, the root sentence, we have substituted chechiye chilo, which means shouted. The result is it's a bad sentence. You cannot say 8 মাফিয়া কাকে মেরেছে বলে তুমি বিশ্বাস করো বলে মেরি ফুকরে উঠেছে বলে জন চেঁচিয়েছিল, which is literally whom did John shout that Mary blurted out that you believe that the mafia killed. That is bad in English, and the equivalent in Bangla is also bad. Now we give you an exercise that provides an opportunity to think about the concept of bridge verb. You see, it makes no sense to postulate a feature bridge unless you have empirical justification for the feature bridge in that language. And the justification is going to depend on the way things play out in that particular language. Thus in Hindi, in the variety of Hindi Urdu where interrogative expletives of the kya type are legitimate, they are accepted, you have to postulate a transformation that licenses these interrogative effect movements in the presence of interrogative expletives. Therefore, it becomes necessary for the verbs which sponsor such licensing, the so-called bridge verbs, to be labeled in terms of whether they trigger the rule. So if you have interrogative expletive insertion, for example, that is one possible implementation of the project, then you need a feature plus IEI for interrogative expletive insertion. That feature will then appear on the relevant verbs, which we've been informally calling bridge verbs. Bridge is a metaphor. We are cashing that check in terms of a feature plus IEI and minus IEI. That's what the exercise asks you to work out. It then proceeds to ask you, can you generalize this across languages? Can you find a way to tie together the mechanism you need in Hindi Urdu, the mechanism you need in Bangla, the mechanism you need in English, etc. We leave this for you to work out. We are trying to help you to consolidate and finalize your thinking on these issues as best you can, given the gadgetry that we have shown you so far, because the gadgetry is going to become more sophisticated in advanced syntax. And meanwhile, you need to sharpen your skills of exploration, analysis, putting things together, getting a complete picture, getting the details right. And that cannot wait for advanced syntax. Unless you start running now, you will be out of breath when people ask you to start running in an advanced part of the course. We have illustrated some successive cyclic processes. We now turn to matters of oblique subjects which affect other cyclic processes. You know that direct subjects, canonical subjects, are the ones which are nominative and which control agreement on the verb. You find these across all languages that have agreement at all. They're very common. We have shown you in one of the earlier modules that there are some non-nominative subjects in a language like Hindi, Urdu, or a language like Esperanto. At that stage, we didn't stress that you can find the phenomenon even in English. In fact, we suggested that maybe you won't find them in English. If you look very hard, however, it turns out that you find a couple of English examples hiding in a corner. Why don't we show you one of these examples and explain how we can be sure that these are examples of an oblique subject? We therefore ask you to pay attention to example 11 in English. The sentence, "It never occurred to me to ask why," where me controls deletion of the volatile subject downstairs in the infinitival clause subject to ask why, where that subject gets deleted. The question is whether "it never occurred to me to ask why" should be considered a case of object-controlled deletion of the downstairs subject or subject-controlled deletion. As you know, both kinds of control exist in English. So the fact that 11 has deletion of the downstairs volatile subject doesn't tell you anything about the upstairs controller, whether "to me" is an oblique subject, as we are suggesting, or whether it's actually an indirect object. How do you know that it's an oblique subject? One method of diagnosing a subject, one method of showing that something claimed to be a subject is indeed a subject, is to check what happens when you attach an adverbial participle clause to the sentence. Consider sentence 14 in this light. 14 begins with "Sally persuaded John to leave" and attaches an adverbial participle to it. Having heard that there would be trouble, Sally persuaded John to leave. Now it turns out that the adverbial participle clause, having heard that there would be trouble, gets its volatile subject deleted under identity with the matrix subject Sally. It is Sally who has heard that there would be trouble before Sally persuades John to leave. Perfectly generally across the world's languages, if there is going to be controlled deletion of the subject of an adverbial participle clause, the controller of that process is the upstairs subject, nothing else. We showed this by giving you example 14. Now if you go to example 13, you will find that in the structure we were talking about, "It never occurred to me to ask why." "To me" is an oblique subject. Why? Well, look at example 13. "Having lived in hot countries," adverbial participle whose subject is controlled by "to me," "it never occurred to me to ask why people there bathe so often." Now that you know that controlling an adverbial participle subject position is a diagnostic for matrix subjecthood, you can tell that in "it never occurred to me," indeed "to me" is an oblique subject, even though English doesn't normally allow oblique subject. In other languages, unlike English, there are many more oblique subjects. It's a fairly common phenomenon. These oblique subjects are sometimes experiencers rather than fully active agents. In other words, they're about things that happen to you rather than things you do. And very often these languages have pairs of sentences where one type of sentence has a direct nominative subject and the other type of sentence has an oblique subject, a non-nominative subject, which plays an experiencer role rather than an agent role. Thus in Bangla, you get the contrast between 15 and 16. 15 is a direct subject sentence where you get "Rupen won't agree to go out in the midday's sun." This takes the form Rupen Raji hobe na, Rupen won't agree. nominative subject controlling agreement on the verb. And there's an embedded sentence, Dupur rode berote, to go out in the midday sun, and Rupen controls the subject of that embedded sentence. This contrasts with example 16, where the controller of the subject of the embedded sentence is in the genitive case, one of the non-nominative or oblique cases. That makes it an oblique subject, and it is associated with the semantics of an experiencer. Example 16 is, Rupen is afraid of going out in the midday sun. In Bangla, Rupener, genitive ending er, Dupur rode berote, bhoy kore. Bhoy kore is fear. Dupur rode berote is to go out in the midday sun. Now, in addition to the difference that we've already reported between English and the Indian languages, where English on the whole avoids oblique subjects, whereas in Indian languages they're abundant, there is another difference, and in this respect English shares the property with several other European languages. We're talking about the fact that English allows inanimate noun phrases, as in 18, and even clauses, which are of course inanimate, as in 19, to be subjects of verbs that trigger object control. Notice that we are making a very tricky statement. So look carefully at example 18. The high cost of living forced him, downstairs clause, to cut down on luxuries. Now the point isn't about the controller. The controller is the object him. Him controls the subject of the downstairs clause, cut down on luxuries. The point is about the subject of the control trigger. The control trigger is the verb force upstairs. Forced him to cut down. The subject of force is the high cost of living, which is an inanimate subject. This is very unusual. It happens in English but does not happen in Indian languages. Likewise, the upstairs subject can, instead of being an inanimate subject in English, it can be a clause instead of being an inanimate NP. Clauses are always inanimate. That the cost of living was high, a clause, forced him to cut down on luxuries. Now, English allows this luxury, if we may put it that way. In English, since such a subject, an inanimate noun phrase or a clause, cannot possibly be associated with the verb having a volitional interpretation as a deliberate, planned action, need to be compared with sentences like the key opened the door, where the key is an inanimate subject and where, as a result, open is seen not as an action but as an event. Now, in Indian languages, you can't do this. You can neither say the key opened the door, nor can you allow an inanimate noun phrase or a clause to serve as the subject of an object control trigger. Thus, consider a literal translation into an Indian language like Bangla of the English sentences 18 and 19. The sentence 18 comes out as Drobbo mulle prochondo briddhi, the rise in the prices. Okay, him or her. Bilashita bandho korte, to cut down on luxuries. Baddho korlo, forced. This is bad Bangla. It's not horrible Bangla, it's not completely unintelligible, but it's pretty bad. People would, as far as possible, avoid saying it. And if somebody says it, people would say, ah, this is a foreigner who's learning Bangla and is literally translating from some other language that has very different properties. We wouldn't say this. Yes, we understand what's being said, but that's not the way we talk. When you shift from an inanimate subject of an object control trigger to a clausal subject, as in 21, translation of 19 into Bangla, দ্রব্য মূল্য যে প্রচণ্ড বেড়েছে, the fact that the price of goods has gone up steeply, এটা, this, ওকে বিলাসিতা বন্ধ করতে বাধ্য করলো, forced him to cut down on luxuries. This is crashingly bad in Bangla. It's an impossible sentence. So far we've been talking about the subject of the matrix clause. When we turn to the controller of an object control clause like this, there is yet another difference between European languages and Indian languages. Namely, the matrix object can be an inanimate controller. Thus, you have in English sentences like, these poorly understood factors somehow force the inflation rate, embedded sentence, to shoot up, where the inflation rate becomes the controller NP for the deletion of the downstairs subject. This, when you translate it into Indian languages like Bangla and Hindi, Urdu, sounds like translationese. It sounds like somebody's taken an English sentence and has just done a literal rendering into an Indian language. It does not sound like what a speaker of Hindi, Urdu or a speaker of Bangla would say. This is not as severe a problem as that of 20 and 21, though it is on the same footing, in that sentences which sound like translationese are already on their way to possible integration into the stylistic repertoire of a language. We are not sure that the situation is ripe for a grammarian to step in and say, this is a major difference and it has to be recorded in the description. But this is a matter on which tastes and opinions are bound to differ, and we basically leave it to you to form your opinion. In this course, we are not trying to mold your opinion. We are trying to show you the way to arrive at your own judgment on these issues and sharpen your tools. We promised that this module would deal both with cyclic phenomena and with root phenomena. We have now finished with the cyclic processes that were going to be discussed here. We now turn to some root processes. In module 17, we introduced the Bangla example 24. Prodhan সমস্যা হচ্ছে ওষুধের অভাব. The main problem is lack of medicine, which is peculiar because that verb to be, the copula হচ্ছে, is a positive polarity copula. It doesn't occur in the environment of negation, and it very strangely occupies the medial position in the sentence, although Bangla is a language where verbs normally pick the canonical position at the end of the sentence and prefer that position. In contrast to ordinary verbs, this copula in Bangla has to be in the middle of the sentence, as we pointed out in module 17. Now we turn to a slightly more complex set of root phenomena to give you a taste of what there is to explore among root transformations. Certain phenomena in Bangla have been called Q-bar phenomena because they involve interaction between Q, question words, and ba, a particular particle. You get the construction in two variants, where the Q appears on the left of the ba or where the Q appears on the right. If it appears to the left, you get example 25. Ora kakei ba dakpe, they who ba will invite, which means whom indeed will they invite. If the Q appears to the right of the ba, you get ora dakbei ba kake, they will invite indeed who, which means whom indeed will they invite. Such an utterance is called a special question, by which one means that these are not information-seeking questions. They are questions that are being thrown up a little bit like an exclamation or like a rhetorical question or like the kind of talking that expresses despair, dejection, consternation or some other emotion. The point is not to get the listener to give an answer. The point is to tell the listener that you're in a particular kind of mood or that you're showing a particular kind of attitude. These are called special questions. For this bunch of data, We can formulate a transformation. We have not given you an exercise to do it because the whole thing is tricky. We've done it for you at example 27 called Q bar placement, a root transformation. We are showing you some gadgetry here. Notice that in examples 25 and 26, we have exemplified the Q bar order and the bar Q order. Therefore, the transformation has to generate both. How do you do it? Notice that it's a root transformation, so it begins its work only after all the cyclic processes have already applied. Therefore, since the cyclic processes in their wisdom may have pushed things around a little bit and messed up the sequence in which the furniture is arranged in the sentence, you cannot take it for granted that you will see something very closely resembling the deep structure state of affairs. So the input that you're looking at is possibly a messed up, jumbled up input, and you can't make too many assumptions about it when you state your structural description. What we propose, therefore, since bar works in close conjunction with the focus particle E, is to put that E bar at the heart of the rule as the second factor and have a variable on the left, x, to cover whatever needs to be covered, and then to find two variable constituents, which we call y and w, such that one of them is an interrogative and the other is not an interrogative. Why do we want to do this? Because we want to say, take one of them and put it on the left of E bar. What that does is it allows you to generate the question E bar something else sequence as well as the something else E bar question sequence. Since we're not discriminating between questions and non-questions by giving equal opportunity to both in our feature marking, we will get both the outcomes that we want. The way to write this is to label y as having the feature alpha wh, where alpha is plus or minus, and to label w as being minus alpha wh. All that this says is that whatever alpha is, minus alpha is the opposite of that. So if y is plus wh, then w is minus wh. If y is minus wh, then w is plus wh. So with this understanding, we then take y and move it to the left of E bar. That is the work that the transformation does. And since y has a variable coefficient alpha that ranges over the values plus and minus, that means whatever the value of y, it will land to the left of E bar. That means that half the time it will be a question constituent and half the time it will be something else. We are now ready to inform you about an extra piece of complexity that will not be reflected in our formal account. We just want to show you how hard these problems are. There are some E bar sentences in which there is no WH word present. Some of them are built around a verb in what is called the past subjunctive. Example 28. Which means, so Dilip has eaten slightly too many nuts, let him. This comes out in Bangla as Dilip khelo I ba ektu beshi badam. Ektu beshi badam is a little too many nuts. And Dilip is Dilip. So khelo I ba contains all the semantics of so he has eaten, let him. That is what is being expressed here. Now you have syntactic variation here also. You can place the khelo I ba at the beginning of the sentence, the middle of the sentence, or the end of the sentence. We are not asking you to write a rule for this. We're not writing one for you. The reason we bring this in is that given that the past subjunctive has L in its morphology, khelo, and given that one of the variants of the positive polarity copula we talked about earlier has the same morphology, it ends in lo in the third person, it turns out that you can freely attach a past subjunctive feature to the positive polarity copula and then attach this E bar particle. When that happens, the positive polarity copula, which is normally imprisoned in the middle of the sentence, suddenly becomes free to dance around, to appear at the beginning or at the end. So in example 30, where we have displayed 3 possible positions for the positive polarity copula to which this feature has been added and therefore to which the sequence of particles E and bar has been attached, can appear initially, medially, or finally in the sentence. We show it as one line, but we want you to pronounce it only one word at a time. You can either say the initial position variant, holo iba prodhan shomosya oshudher obhab, or the medial variant, prodhan shomosya holo iba oshudher obhab, or the final variant, prodhan shomosya oshudher obhab holo iba. Obviously, no particular sentence will have 2 verbs in initial and medial position and so on. We're trying to show you 3 orders rolled into 1. Notice that this variant cannot possibly contain an interrogative, both because the positive polarity copula is incompatible with it, and also because when the past subjunctive becomes the point around which the bar particle is organized, it excludes interrogation. The past subjunctive is incompatible with a question constituent in the clause. Now, one difference between Q bar and the past subjunctive construction with bar is that Q bar, being interrogative, appears in successive cyclic interrogation contexts. For example, if you consider 30, which has the meaning, who indeed did you hear Raka said Nripin thought they would invite? The form in Bangla has the question word in its original place as the object of the lowest, most deeply embedded S. And there is a series of quotative complementizers, bole, bridging the gap at the boundary of each S all the way up. As a consequence, the interrogative effect as well as the special root sentence effect of the particle bar travel all the way up the cycles and reach the root sentence, producing the semantic effect at the top of the structure. There is no question of any of this happening for the past subjunctive variant of the bar phenomenon, because the past subjunctive doesn't interact with interrogation, it excludes interrogation. And therefore there are no bridges ready for its effect to travel from a deeply embedded sentence all the way up. In other words, the bridges are giving service not to the bar particle by itself. They are giving service to the interrogation. And if the interrogation has a bar attached, then the bridges are happy to let the bar cross the bridges. Bar by itself cannot expect service from the bridges. We can now summarize what has happened in this module. We were surveying some cyclic and root processes in Indian languages for you in order not only to show you the coverage of the model we have been teaching, but also to encourage you to explore phenomena in your languages that either differ in certain details from the English data you've been studying, or phenomena that don't occur in English at all, or that occur extremely marginally, such as oblique subjects. In this module, we have explored oblique subjects marginally in English and abundantly in other languages, especially Indian languages. We have also shown you some sharp differences between European and Indian languages with respect to control constructions, what is possible and what is not possible in the subject and object slots of object control verbs. We have shown you that inanimate noun phrases and clauses are acceptable as subjects of an object control trigger verb in European languages, but not in Indian languages. And we have explored the ways to encode this in the grammatical rule statements. In the final section of this module, we have explored some constructions that occur only in root sentences, which are built around the Bangla clause particle ba, in two variants, the variant that focuses on interrogatives and the variant that is built around a focal past subjunctive morphology. We have shown you how the latter interacts with the positive polarity copula, which is another root phenomenon in this Indian language. The purpose of this survey is to get you accustomed to dealing with material from Indian languages in the context of this syntactic theory. We encourage you to keep exploring and to not get disheartened if sometimes the answers you give to exercises don't match what the course teacher or organizers have in mind when they have given you these exercises. The point of the exercises is not to get exactly the same answer, but for you to sharpen your reasoning processes in relation to the architecture of this model. Please keep reading the e-texts. They are supremely important. Notice that when we introduced successive cyclic raising in the e-text for module 24, the oral exposition did not cover it. That is going to happen from time to time. Don't get disheartened or startled when that happens. Please send us any feedback you have, and thank you for your attention.